AI tools seem to get in the way of many of the students. And this is very distracting for them, where they would often pause to read the suggestion, accept the code, even though it was wrong.
The more that they're relying on AI systems and the less that they're monitoring and paying attention to what they're doing, side effects and bugs can start cropping up more and more. A lot of these negative consequences that are much less obvious and much harder to measure.
It was just so much more exacerbated by AI.
Different ways that generative AI is undermining social interactions within the classroom, the learning communities that are being developed.
20 years ago, you asked, why don't you just Google it? And now you ask, why don't you just ChatGPT it?
Generative AI promising all kinds of things. And my concern is that at each of these stages, people feeling more and more lonely, more and more isolated.
Thank you again, and welcome to today's conversation about the relationship between critical thinking and generative AI tool use. I'm joined by Dr. James Prather and Professor Steve MacNeil, who published the study last year about AI tool use and how they are creating a widening gap between students who thrive and those who struggle. Their work gives us a view into the unintended consequences of AI in education that not many people are talking about. So let's get started. It would be great if you can give me a quick introduction of yourself. While you do that, can you help me answer this question? What motivates you to the field of generative AI's impact on novice programmers? James, would you like to start?
Hi, I'm James Prather, and I am an associate professor of computer science at Abilene Christian University. I've been studying generative AI in computer science education for the last 4 years, since modern large language models hit the scene in scholarly circles. I've been increasingly concerned about student cognition and problem solving in introductory computer science. I teach an introductory computer science course to first-year students, which is a large part of my motivation to study this. I want to help my students in this new world. These tools exist. They're going to use them whether I like it or not. So how can I help them use them responsibly, appropriately, in ways that help their learning rather than hurt it? Steve?
My name is Steve MacNeil. I'm an assistant professor at Temple University. At Temple, I run a large undergraduate research lab. Working with many students, it's been interesting to see the varied perspectives. Students are really excited about these tools and opportunities that it's going to make their lives easier, it's going to make things better for them. And then there's a lot of students who are on the other end where they're really fearful about the societal ethical implications, concerned about what it means for their careers. In trying to help those students navigate what this is going to mean for them, it's been a big interest for me to understand the cognitive impacts, good and bad, the metacognitive impacts, the social impacts, the ethical impacts. These are becoming really important. It almost feels like a moral obligation to figure this out for all of these students that are counting on us. That's been my driver for getting more involved in this.
Thank you very much for the introduction. If you don't mind, I'd like to start asking 1 or 2 questions in regards to your research methods. Why only 21 participants and no more? Would this number be significant enough to your findings?
Yeah, that's a good question. We did a study in my introductory programming course, often called CS1 in the literature. I teach at a small liberal arts university, and that's the number of students who signed up for the study. Unlike quantitative studies, and we have run large quantitative studies with 1,000 students where we can show statistical significance. This study was a qualitative observational user study, and 21 is certainly enough for legitimate findings in that regard.
Yeah.
Steve, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think for a lot of the empirical work, the goal is to show generalizable findings. It's to say, like, this is a trend that we're observing and it probably holds for everyone. But there's a lot of limitations in terms of what you can do with those kinds of quantitative studies. Oftentimes you have to control for a lot of variables. you remove a lot of the things that make the study interesting. You have to really control for a lot. In this study, it was great because we could do very deep qualitative research. So being able to do eye tracking methodology and other things like that are very hard to generalize, sort of how people are doing like sequence analysis on how people are looking at this part and then looking at that part and then doing this and then doing that. It's very, very hard to generalize those kinds of behaviors. So this kind of a qualitative methodology is really appropriate given the kinds of things we're investigating and all.
You actually mentioned a very interesting point, and that's my follow-up question. You have eye tracking data and some qualitative observation. So what behaviors reveal the most striking disconnect between students' perception of AI interactions and their understanding?
One thing that's nice about having the eye tracking tools is that we can be sure where they're looking, that I can quantify how long they spent reading the problem description. I can see how long they spent reading AI generated code. That really helps us form better, more descriptive patterns of the novice use of these tools. A couple of things emerged. The first one is that the AI tools seemed to get in the way of many of the students. They were using GitHub Copilot, which generates code suggestions on the fly really quickly. Often every character I type, it will generate a new suggestion based on what it thinks the next best thing is for what you need right now. And so those are flashing on the screen constantly. And sometimes it'll do one line, sometimes it'll do many lines. And these novices, they're just learning how to read and write code. And this is very distracting for them, to the point where they would often pause to read the suggestion. Even if it was incorrect, they would still look at it, think about it, and then oftentimes accept the code, drop it into their code file, even though it was wrong. It wouldn't help them at all towards a solution, only for them to later realize this and have to delete it and start over. And one of the students in particular had read the problem description and was thinking about what to do and started typing and working on a solution. You could see that they had an idea about what they were going to do. And then the AI tool dropped a bunch of code into their file and they paused to read it and consider it. And it was wrong. By the time they figured that out, they couldn't remember what they were doing. The quote was, "What was I doing again?" It interrupts their train of thought. It distracts them. For the poorer performing students, we saw these kinds of behaviors. Students with lower self-efficacy, lower grades, the AI tools often got in the way of success. The second thing was that there appeared to be a cognitive dissonance between their performance in the session where they're writing the code and trying to solve the problem, and in the post-interview survey, where in the session, many students would struggle and took a very winding path to the solution, but they managed to solve it finally because AI helped them. While it's impossible to know if they would have solved it without AI, from our expert point of view, it seems unlikely. But then when they're talking about it in the interview afterwards, they seemed to have this idea that they solved it. Watching the poorest performers who still managed to solve it because of AI, seeing that cognitive dissonance between the session and their interview was just astounding. Oh, and now I'm fireworking. Steve, what do you want to add to that?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. For me, that was one of the more interesting findings was this cognitive dissonance. It's one thing when models are leading students off track, and that's problematic, obviously. But when it actually feels like it's helping them be more productive, or when it feels like they're moving more efficiently toward a solution, obviously that's worse. It's one of those things where if you're getting led off track, at least hopefully you can identify that or see that. And this was actually a replication study of one of James's earlier papers. He had a really nice paper from 2018 And in that paper, they were looking at some of the metacognitive challenges that students face when they're learning. It was interesting to see that we're seeing those same kinds of metacognitive challenges and more metacognitive challenges that are emerging. And
So you,
specifically the one that James mentioned was this one of interruption, which is challenging.
Yeah.
so
And-
you already had a suspicion
Oh, yeah.
this kind of behavior is happening.
I've done several of these kinds of observational studies before, but they were all before AI. I had a suspicion that a lot of these things were still going on, but I wanted to see how AI had impacted these previously identified metacognitive difficulties that students were encountering and experiencing. We used the exact same programming problem from the previous study that Steve mentioned. In the previous study, about a third of the class couldn't solve the problem. There was a significant number of students who, in the time window, it was 35 minutes, just couldn't solve the problem. In that study, each one of those students had to face the reality of, I can't solve this problem. I didn't do it. But only one student didn't solve the problem. And even that student was extremely close. And of course, AI was the reason. But my point is that in this new study and in our new AI-driven world, many of these students won't have to face this kind of realization of, oh no, I can't do this. I should study more. I should work harder. I need to do something to fix this. They're not going to hit the wall like they used to. And I think that is a problem because it forms an incorrect self-assessment of their abilities.
Was there already cognitive dissonance before AI, or is this only induced once generative AI is broadly applied to programming?
I don't think it was as bad. I don't think it was as noticeable. In the previous studies, I remember students saying things like, I know this, but I get nervous in the moment, or they would say, I'm pretty sure I could have solved this if I had more time, those kinds of things. There's a little bit of cognitive dissonance, but it was just so much more exacerbated by AI in this case.
And I think monitoring the ability to pay attention to where you are in your learning process and how you're performing is a key part of metacognition. But something students did struggle with before, but now it's becoming a much harder aspect of it. So it's really hard for them to monitor their own learning because it's hard to know what's coming from me versus what's coming from this agent. In the short term, these things are problematic, but in the longer term, as they start encountering more complex problems, that's where we really start to see things fall apart. And go for it.
No, sorry. Just because of what you said, I'm really interested in understanding like what will happen once they started their career as a programmer or as an engineer. Like what will impact their long-term skill and career development, you think?
I think in terms of, we already have these issues, and I think they're going to become a lot worse. We already have issues where when you're working on really large, complex software, you make changes, you do things that have all of these unintended bugs that you don't encounter right away, all of these side effects and things. I think that's one of the big things that's definitely at risk when they're starting to get into industry. The more that they're relying on AI systems and the less that they're monitoring and paying attention to what they're doing, I feel like these kinds of side effects and bugs can start cropping up more and more, and they may be less able to identify and sort of see these negative side effects that are coming up in their code. And, that's going to be a problem. And they may be even less able to not just diagnose, but also, intervene and fix those problems.
It's really interesting what you just said. I did research for my newsletter last year about how much productivity AI code assistants would actually improve. It turns out AI code assistants improves productivity by like 30 to 40%, depending on how you measure it. But if you dig deeper, you will realize it also generates a lot of bugs, and a lot of codes it generates don't really fit in the bigger program, no matter how detailed the prompt that you give to AI. And there is also a paper that has observed this kind of cognitive dissonance, especially between more junior programmers and senior ones.
Yeah, I have a friend who is the head of engineering at a very large tech company. He told me that when he gets the chance to step into code reviews with junior developers, he'll ask them questions about the code they generated. Like, hey, tell me why you did this right here. And they'll say ChatGPT wrote it. His reply is, did you think about these trade-offs between this algorithm and this other one? And look at the security thing here. They're not thinking critically. These new junior developers, it works, doesn't it? And they're not thinking about the trade-offs of the code that's generated and why or why not it may, yeah, it works, but it may not be good. And they're just kind of uncritically using this, which fits the general pattern of the paper that we wrote. One of my motivations for doing this paper in the first place was seeing several studies where people use generative AI in their programming course, and then they asked students, what do you think about it? And the students said, it was great. And then they published that result. And that seemed to give a very uncritical hype to generative AI in ways that made me uncomfortable. This is one reason why I wanted to dig down into watching students actually use it to solve a programming problem. And what we found was disturbing.
So then I'm curious, because most of the studies that I'd be able to find are all related to programmer behavior or students in computer science, how they interact with AI and how generative AI help those students or make the situation slightly worse. Do you think this apply to fields outside of computer science or programming, for example, to students in marketing?
Yeah, I definitely think so. What James is getting at is a really important point about performance and success. The junior developers typically care a lot about writing efficiency. Can they produce something quickly? Whereas seniors are thinking more about maintenance, reliability, and other core values. I think that's true across domains. We're measuring a lot of the wrong things right now. We're measuring things like how quickly we get, if it's in marketing, how quickly we can get the brief created. We're not thinking about how an obviously AI-generated text might undermine brand credibility. I think it's really what we're paying attention to right now are a lot of these surface things that are easy to measure and easy to talk about, as James said a second ago, but there's a lot of these negative consequences that are much less obvious and much harder to measure. It's very hard to measure trust in a brand and brand engagement. It's easier to measure how many people see it or like it, or how small you can make your marketing department to pump out more content. But there's different measures of performance, and I think that's something we need to be very critical of. And so across domains, it's useful to think about what are the efficiency measures, the performance measures, and what are also the measures on the other side of what can go wrong and what negative consequences there might be, and how do we measure those? And I think with our study, that's kind of the point, right? It's hard to measure those things. That's why we needed this deeply qualitative study that was very difficult to run and analyze and took a lot of effort. The era of generative AI, where everything's just moving so fast and things are going out the door all the time, the easier, more convenient measures are going to be the ones that get prioritized, unfortunately.
I remember some tech leads just measured story points as weekly output instead of trying to measure what is the outcome. Do you think there's a correlation between how we view things at work and how it impacts education or students when they start to work on their assignments? Do they also have the same mindset?
Yeah, I think output and productivity are always valorized over consequences. But consequences are the things that often matter. Who's being harmed, what the negative impact might be, especially marginalized groups, broadly construed. I mean, across domains, there's always going to be ways that we tend to bias toward how is this going to help the majority of people, but not thinking about someone with disabilities or otherwise, how are they going to be impacted? And so, yeah, it's a problem. But I think looking at consequences and more diverse perspectives is a ton of work and may not be financially justified for a lot of companies, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And if that's ultimately the measure for shareholders or otherwise, that's going to be what gets optimized.
A lot of corporate, especially in the US, and in Western countries, myopic focus on short-term profits that drive these behaviors. This study was funded by Google. I want to give them a shout out because, and I'm not saying they might be guilty of this in other places or something, but they wanted to know about this problem. They wanted us to investigate this. When we came back with some real problems, it wasn't a rosy picture of how AI was going to help everyone and help everyone understand more and go faster and do better. It was actually hurting half the group. I remember a phone call with them after I sent the initial paper to them, since they're a funder, and they said, "We think this is really important and you should publish it." They were very supportive, even though it wasn't what we expected to find. And it may not fit the overall narrative of everyone hyping generative AI. I was really impressed with their collegiality in that regard.
I also referenced another study done by Microsoft. It's a really similar study, but it's a more relationship between how AI tools would impact critical thinking.
I saw it. It's been good to see kind of a confirmation of our findings since we published that in August. But yeah, that Microsoft article, there was an article at the conference we just went to,
Yeah,
went to SIGSI, where they saw the exact same kind of thing, but in an upper level software engineering course. So ours was with novices, first semester students, and theirs was with juniors, third year students, and they saw very similar behaviors of this like kind of two paths outcomes. And so it's been good to see our findings confirmed now by other groups.
And I think that
Sounds safe.
triangulation is very necessary for something complicated like this. You want to understand how it's impacting students at the junior level, at the senior level, how it's affecting professionals in the workplace. That ability to look at this same problem from many different perspectives is going to be really necessary. We also had 2 papers from last year, and we were on a working group, James and I together, where we were seeing this sort of bimodal distribution and usage. And so that's kind of another aspect of this as well. So you're seeing in our current study that we're talking about today, there's this sort of bimodal distribution in terms of performance, but there's also this bimodal distribution in terms of usage. And I think that's changing a little bit over time as more and more people are embracing these AI tools in their day-to-day lives. But it has a lot of similarities to, there was a digital divide in the 90s where some people had access to the internet and other people didn't. The people who had access to the internet had all of these free resources that they could learn from, and others who were in rural areas or didn't have a PC at home didn't have that same access. And so we're seeing really big differences in learning gains and performance in schools that were driven by that divide. Some students are using it a lot and they're getting benefits from it. Other students aren't using it a whole lot and they're not getting benefits from it. Different students have different AI literacy, and that's also impacting sort of what they get out of it. So, if someone's really capable of using AI tools, get benefits from it. If they're not very capable of using AI tools, they're going to get harms from it. And so it's a very complicated space. I think it's exciting to see so many of these different papers looking at it from all of these different perspectives and helping us explore what that actually ends up looking like.
So I'm curious what you said about this bimodal distribution that you have observed. Did you look into the demographic, for example, the differences between their education level or the differences between their household income? Because there's something I saw in another study. Those who have a higher education tend to think more critically when they use Gen AI tool, the same as those more experienced in the workspace. Did you have similar observations or even deeper in how demographic will also impact these kind of bimodal distribution you mentioned?
We had a little bit, but I don't think we were really doing that aspect justice. There's a paper coming out soon by a friend of mine, Yash Tadmila. He's doing some work looking at intersectionality around different perspectives of AI usage. That should be coming out this summer, actually, that paper, to understand not just the usage, but also different people and the perspectives of those people about AI. Because there's different trust in AI systems, the way that people perceive them, it's whether they perceive them, the framing, is it positive, is it negative? Do they think that AI is a tool for good or for bad? Whether or not they personify AI agents, these are all things that are going to impact performance.
Yeah.
and impact usage.
It sounds
Yeah.
like a very interesting study. Is there any chance that you can forward that study to me, or even
course.
better if I can get to know the researcher? Because I try to look into Gen AI adoption, and there was not much study. And even, yes, I find their data doesn't add up if you're looking at what they provide and what other papers have mentioned. It would be really interesting if there are more of these demographic related studies on how different demographics will impact AI use, because I haven't seen enough to justify the theory they're trying to project.
What we've seen a little bit too is that there's not just, all of this is very preliminary in some of the studies that we've done, but like, it's not just a difference in demographics, it's also differences in the type of AI usage. I think we often talk about AI adoption, but what we've seen is that ChatGPT is adopted at a really high rate, but a lot of other AI tools are not being adopted very well. So things like GitHub Copilot, very few students are using GitHub Copilot. Some students are fortunate to have professors like James and Leo Porter who are encouraging the use of GitHub Copilot in the earlier courses, but that's not so common. We're finding that many students aren't using Copilot.
Yeah.
And so that's another thing of, is it an open model? Is it the free version of ChatGPT? Is it the premium version? All of those are going to be very different experiences. And again, we can see that digital divide where students with more money who can afford the monthly fees for the premium version might be getting a better model than students using just the free tier of ChatGPT.
Yeah, exactly. Saw a similar study in Denmark about ChatGPT usage among developers. Between female and male developers, there will be more male developers subscribing to ChatGPT proportionally, like 10 or 20% less females would subscribe and pay for it. But there is no reason given from that study. I find it interesting, and there's no way to know the reason why. I just realized I already took much more time from both of you than I thought it would be.
That's all right. We like talking about this.
It's been a lot of fun. So I kind of lost track of time.
That's great. I have one or two questions. It's more about your future study, but also how do you think the industry will be incentivized to create or not to close this gap? This is something I would like to know, as well as your future research. Like, what other things do you want to find out to help people understand the impact, how people can self-help, or what do you expect industry to do?
I'm not sure how industry is going to handle this problem. Some of it is how are students being prepared to go into industry from university. But if I was a director of software engineering at a company, I would probably turn off these things for the new hires, right? Just look, get some time under your belt, write the code yourself, get used to our habits and our practices and our code base. After a year or two, we'll turn it on for you. Maybe that's a little naive, but I would want people to get their feet under them first before trying to utilize these tools. When I'm thinking about my own experience graduating, I worked as a software developer for 4 years before going back to graduate school. That first year was an amazing amount of progress in my ability to write code. I graduated with a computer science degree, thought I knew how to code, but my abilities transformed drastically over that first year. I don't want to rob someone of that experience.
Yeah, it will be interesting to see how different companies handle the upcoming talent gap. Because if I'm a CEO and I see some engineers make progress with an AI assistant to help them code, I wouldn't want to turn it off and go back to how we used to do things. We want to release as many features to our customers as possible. It would be very hard to say, no, we're not using this today.
Yeah, for sure. Our future work, Steve and I do a lot of work together. Our shared interest is in trying to help find new ways of teaching programming and generative AI intertwined together so that we scaffold students' experiences of learning programming with generative AI. They're using it responsibly, learning to avoid pitfalls we've uncovered. They're also learning to see the relationship between the things the code that's generated and they're still learning all the classic computer science skills necessary for success in their jobs. You want to add that, Steve?
Yeah, I think that's kind of the big one. We're both trained, we work a lot in computing education research. We're also both trained as human-computer interaction researchers. And so that's more of a design perspective. That design perspective, which is heavily rooted in human experiences, is very informed, is very much informing this critical perspective of what are some of the things that can go wrong and how can we intervene and develop systems that can make those things better. We've been working on some systems together to scaffold the use of these tools. These tools are designed for software engineers. They're not designed for learning. So we've been thinking about how can we refine them and revise them so that they can be appropriate for educational contexts. One other thing that we've got coming up that I'm excited about is a paper that's starting to look at some of the social aspects. We have a paper in submission right now showing some of the actual social harms, different ways that generative AI is undermining social interactions within the classroom, the learning communities that are being developed. And that's problematic because the primary reason why students go to traditional brick and mortar universities is build their network. They can make friends, they can work together with other students, develop their soft skills. They uncover a hidden curriculum of how the world works and how society works and how industry works. And all of that is at risk as well as students increasingly point each other to ChatGPT, modern just Google it phenomenon. We saw some interesting stories where students would make themselves vulnerable and reach out to a friend and say, hey, I'm really struggling. I'm working on this homework. I just can't figure it out. And they're like, ChatGPT, bro, just go online, use ChatGPT. And that's a really depressing scenario when you're going so far out of your way for some human engagement and you're getting redirected to an AI agent. So that's one of the papers I'm very excited about. It's in submission right now, and hopefully we'll get a decision today. So fingers crossed.
So what do you think is the difference? Would be like 20 years ago, you asked people, why don't you just Google it? And now you ask people, why don't you just ChatGPT it? What's the difference, you say?
I think the difference is that the help you get is so much better. You really can meet an information need so much faster. The internet promised we'd be more connected than ever. Social media promised we'd be more connected than ever, more opportunities to interact with and share diverse opinions. Now we have generative AI promising all kinds of things. And my concern is that at each of these stages, people feeling more and more lonely, more and more isolated. I think this is going to be a continuous trend unless we can do something about it. So that's been something I'm really interested in. How do we think about preserving these human interactions at a time where they've been under threat in the pandemic, they've been under threat through social media. It's a continuous trend toward us feeling more divided and less connected. And so that was one of the reasons why we started working on that project. It's just becoming so convenient to point people to a good information resource in a lot of cases. Like I said, it can provide similar quality help. We have a few papers on that too, of provide similar quality explanations to the ones that students produce. And so if from their perspective, if the quality is just as good, why not point them in that direction rather than spending my time to help? But I think there's so much that you gain by helping others and talking to people. There's so much that's gained by reaching out and asking the question and having a conversation about it. And again, it's a more complex thing to measure, but it's an important aspect.
For me, a key difference with Google is that there was still some amount of critical thinking involved. If you think about 2008, someone had a programming question, they'd type it into Google and look at the different links you could click, the different results, which one is best. You go to one that takes you to Stack Overflow. Someone has asked a similar question, and that's not what I want. I go back through the next one.
Yeah.
Stack Overflow again. Okay, this is close enough. I can modify it to what I need. I'll copy it, paste it, and then do the modification. But crucially with Stack Overflow, most of the time, someone wasn't asking your very specific question. But with something like ChatGPT, you can ask your specific question and get a specific answer right away. And so there's no discernment process happening. There's no cognition needed. You just get the answer and take it. And like we're seeing, with my friend I mentioned earlier, that has problems, right? Junior developers just taking it. Oh, it answered my question and the code works, but they're not thinking critically about why this could be useful or not.
Yeah.
And from a learning
they don't-
thing- go for it.
No. So they no longer needed to go through the adoption steps to trying to adopt an answer they found on Stack Overflow into a scenario that they're trying to resolve. Right now, they simply just apply whatever is on ChatGPT unless it really just doesn't work, come back with an error.
There's a learning theory, which is called transfer learning. So the idea that you learn one thing in one domain and then applying it and considering it in another domain. Essentially, that's what's being lost. Students don't need to read Stack Overflow, internalize an understanding, and then transfer that understanding to their own problem. It's just immediately applied to their problem. That was a big opportunity that's now gone.
Yeah, it would be great if you can forward me the paper once the social harm study is out.
Oh, I'd love to. Yeah.
I would love to read it. One thing, it's interesting. I have a few friends in recruitment. What they are trying to do right now is to find which CVs aren't so much AI generated CVs. They will also get into a stage of how to filter out developers that rely too much on AI and can't think on their own versus the developers who can still solve a problem.
James and I have some great students that are looking for no, but seriously, I think what I often think about is that students who have worked on research, that gives them that critical perspective. And so a lot of the students working in research labs, you can't ChatGPT a research paper, you know what I mean? Like a good research paper. You have to think through, what am I doing? Why am I doing it? And so I've found a lot of our students in our lab, and I know a lot of James students as well, they're developing all of these skills, but outside of the classroom. We're hoping we can do everything we can within the classroom to develop these critical perspectives and develop these scaffolding tools that we've talked about. But I also find that research has been a really amazing resource for students right now, an opportunity for students right now, where they can solve big, complex problems that can't easily be ChatGPT. If it were me in the hiring departments of companies right now, I'd be looking for students with research experience and where they've been solving really big, complex problems.
Yeah, that's a good point. What about those students who been rely on AI for 4 years in their uni? How do they get their first job?
That's a harder question. That's definitely a harder question. Yeah, we're hoping that some of these tools might be ways of helping students recognize the over-reliance they might have, or recognize the skill gap where they need to develop these critical thinking skills. For students who are solely relying on AI to get through their courses, it's going to be hard. The argument that they can learn on the job, problematic, because you need to have a foundation that you can build on to learn on the job. And so if you don't have that foundation, it's really hard. A few people have talked to me about generative AI and said, oh, it's so much easier for students these days because they can get through the classes a lot easier and they don't have to struggle as much. I was like, it was a lot easier for me, being forced to do the work, being forced to develop the foundation, being forced to build on that foundation. It was hard in the first few years and it was easy after that. I think for students, it's the opposite now.
I guess that kind of a cognitive challenge is exactly what you need when you're learning something.
Mm-hmm.
All right. I realize that we already spent an hour. Is there anything else you want to add?
I was supposed to thank you. This is a lot of fun.
Great. Yeah.
I always love chatting with James and talk to you as well. It's just fantastic.
Cool. It's great to hear. Good thing that I am not bothering the researcher by asking stupid questions.
Well, these are great questions.
Awesome. That's great to hear. And thank you again for spending the time. It's really, really nice meeting both of you.
Thank you.
And have a good rest of your day.
Okay, thanks.
Bye.
Talk to you
Bye.
soon. Bye.
If you found value in this conversation, there's more where this came from. Subscribe to Second Order Thinkers, in which I translate complex research into plain English for someone like you who is curious about AI's impacts beyond the hype. Thanks for watching.